So good morning, everyone. This is new material, but it's new old material. And I actually, in hearing what Vineet was saying, I was listening to what he was talking about, and so many of the things that he was talking about were resonating. Actually, very much, I'll unfortunately join him in the HR is dead, but I'll tweak it with HR is dead, long live HR. I think it's more of a question about reframing what the role is. At least that would be my interpretation of that. And one of the things that I want to talk to you about is a particular challenge that organizations face. And this is faced at all levels of the organization. This is a challenge that organizations face because of the changes in the way in which the world works, the changes in the way in which the global economy is set up, changes due to technology, you name it. All the things that are happening are shifting in very fundamental ways, the ways in which we actually organize. And one of the challenges that creates is, as I've sort of put up here, this idea of the overcommitted organization. So what I want to talk to you about today is both these challenges, sort of big picture. I want to talk about what the challenges are in the first place, what is today's reality. This is, research shows that when you give an agenda for a meeting, people are much happier with the meeting. So here's my agenda to make you guys all very happy. So what I want to talk about is first of all, what's actually changing and what's going on. Secondly, what is it that we are doing as a result when we think about the ways in which we organize, the ways in which we try to collaborate and work together, and the ways in which we're doing that. And then we need to talk in a very serious way about both the costs and hopefully some of the ways to try to ameliorate those costs, to try to make things a little bit better. That's my plan. We'll see how well I stick to it. As was mentioned, this is a combination. This is research that we've been doing. I am an academic, so you're getting the official nerd perspective on these things. I like to sit and think and try to understand the ways organizations work, but I do that by going into the field, talking to organizations, collecting data in organizations. Actually, all the SAP and Adidas that were up on the screen, they're both organizations I've collected a lot of data in and worked with to try to understand the ways in which these phenomenon play out. So as I said, I want to talk to you about the overcommitted organization. I want to start by saying, how has the world, what is today's reality? So in the immortal words of Bob Dylan, the times they are a-changin'. So when you think about the ways in which organizations are changing, one thing that has happened is this is no longer today's reality. The idea that a group of people, that teams and collaborations are generally a bunch of people who sit around one conference table and discuss face-to-face and have these debates, work together for a while, get to know each other, all of that, that's unfortunately moving more and more into the past. The ways in which things have changed: number one, global, virtual. Most / all of our work involves not just people sitting around in a room. It's pretty rare that we get everybody in a room here today, although we have lots of people watching live streaming. So initial first evidence of the same thing. You may be collaborating with people who are thousands of kilometers or miles away. You may be collaborating with people who are just a few miles away. You may even be having email conversations with somebody in the same room. Raise your hand if you've ever sent an email to someone in the same room. So we have the impact of technology that is shaping the way in which we collaborate. And this is something I'm very, very interested in. It has fundamental changes in the way in which we relate to other people. But in addition to that, we have another problem. Another challenge or another change that has happened, which is this model that people work in a team for a long period of time just doesn't hold. Our teams, our collaborations are short-term, right? We bring people in as needed. We say, hey, Vineet, we really need an expert in getting out into the community. We need you on board. He comes in for the planning stage, but maybe we move into a later transition phase about logistical execution where he's not the best expert for the job. We transition him out, we bring people in. People are moving in and out of teams and collaborations also not just all the time, but they're doing it piecemeal. It's not one at a time. Sometimes half the group leaves, sometimes a new set comes back in. Or some people leave and return. In all those cases, that means the team, the collaboration itself is a moving target. It doesn't sit as a stable state. It's something that is constantly changing. And on top of that, we have the problem that any one person, as illustrated here with this little montage of photos, any one person doesn't work in one team anymore. They work in many teams. They work in 3, 4, 5, 6 different teams. I play a little game with my MBAs. One of the questions I ask them in the core sort of main initial OB class, I say, how many of you have been working concurrently on at least 2 teams at the same time? And I ask them to raise their hand. Almost every hand goes up, basically every hand. I say, okay, keep your hand up if it's at least 3 teams. Only 1 or 2 go down. They say, okay, how about at least 4 teams, 5 teams? I keep playing this game. I move up and up and up in numbers. I once got to 17. One poor MBA had been in 17 teams at the same time. That means 17 reporting lines, 7 people who got to sign off on when he got to go on vacation. This poor individual sat in the back of the class and sort of twitched uncontrollably. He was broken as a result of this experience. So this is something I want to get you guys thinking about. In particular, this is actually where I want to focus our time. I want to focus our attention on this question about people working on not just one team, not just one project, but across many projects. And what is the impact that that has on the way in which we actually work and collaborate? So, I'm an academic, I like definitions. Here's the official definition. What I want to talk to you about is this idea of multiple team membership. What happens when people are on multiple teams at the same time, concurrently? We can talk about multiple team membership as a situation, as a characteristic of organizations. I guarantee it is characteristic of basically all of your organizations. We can also talk about multi-teaming as an act or as a process, right? This is the way in which each individual person deals with, thinks about, manages these tensions going back and forth between these different pieces. So we want to think about this, and we want to try to understand the impact of it, because it's affecting a huge, huge portion of organizations, right? One set of data puts the number at 81 to 95% of management, and it doesn't decrease all that far as you move down through the organization. So this is a very real challenge faced by a lot of people. So why do we do it? Well, this is one interpretation. Dilbert always has good wisdom, right? So Wally's approach says 3 months, that's how long I've been waiting for you to do your part of the project. Wally's immediate response, perhaps you don't realize how many projects I'm on. Well, have you done any work for the other projects? Well, that would defeat the purpose of having other projects. Now, this is Dilbert, it's tongue-in-cheek, but as with all good humor, there's a small grain of truth in there. We've all used, when we're honest, we've all used the multiple projects as a little bit of a way to say, oh, look, I'm sorry, I'm really busy on the other thing, that's why this isn't here. But there are some much more significant, substantial reasons why this is occurring. So, number 1, complexity. The work that we are doing in our organizations, the types of projects, the types of tasks that we are taking on are increasingly large scale and increasingly complex. As a result, they cannot be managed by single individuals. They can't be managed by single teams. Very often, they need to be tackled by large intersecting groups of teams that have to work together. One of my collaborators on a lot of this work, Heidi Gardner, studies law firms, studies professional service firms. And this is something that she sees over and over again. If you are a law firm and you have global clients, they need global solutions. That means you need to find ways to bring together people all around the globe at a moment's notice, because maybe they have a new litigation that spans across geography. So you can't say, oh, go talk to the London office, because this is a problem that affects the London office, but also the Budapest office, and also the Tokyo office. So this is one benefit, right? Having people across multiple teams allows us to deal with the complexity. It also provides us a benefit by giving us more flexibility. It allows us to adjust on the fly. It allows us to move people around. If something changes, I can move somebody around without necessarily having to lift them out and move them from team to team. They can adjust their time. They can rebalance on the fly. And not only that, you also get an impact on efficiency. This is a big driver for a lot of organizations. They say, look how wonderful this is. I get to squeeze more value out of my employees. I get to get rid of downtime. Right? As organizations, we never like to talk about our employees having nothing to do. We always want to find ways to make sure that every moment that they're not occupied, we find something to occupy them with. Staffing them across multiple teams allows people to actually load balance, to make these adjustments so that when you have a downtime in one project, hey, congratulations, I've got a new project for you, you can focus on that one instead. And it doesn't just end there. We're here talking about HR. One thing I know you care about, and it's nice to have an audience that actually cares about this, is learning and knowledge transfer. You need to move information throughout your organization. Is one of the fundamental core reasons organizations exist in the first place, is to make sure information and knowledge gets where it needs to go. Intersecting teams and collaborations actually provide a vehicle. They basically provide a highway, a roadmap through which information can move through your organization. And last but certainly not least, it's also a source of empowerment. Allowing people the autonomy to make their own decisions about where they allocate their time across multiple projects. And in many cases, when we think about these questions about multiple team membership, we think about these questions, these ideas of multi-teaming, a component part of that is often that people are actually also choosing the projects that they're working on, or at least part of that, which again, it builds autonomy, it builds all the nice things that we get with autonomy. Improved engagement, reduced turnover, stronger motivation. So when you look at a list like this, it shows you there are a lot of nice benefits. It shouldn't be a surprise to any of you when you look at this list that organizations have embraced this, whether they're doing it consciously or unconsciously. All of the actions that we have move us towards a situation in which people are working across many, many different projects at the same time. So why is this a challenge? Well, it's a challenge in part because of the way we tend to execute it. And I'm going to argue, based on the conversations we've had with lots of organizations, that it is largely demand-driven, and we largely lack the big picture. I ask this in a lot of executive ed programs when I'm sitting there with a group of senior executives from an organization in the classroom. I say, look, do your people work on many projects? Of course. We use them well, we're effective, it's wonderful. Great. Do they know what projects they're on? Of course they know what projects they're on. What do you think? We have stupid executives? They know exactly what they're doing, all this list. I said, great. Do you know what projects they're on? There's usually a big pause. Because typically, while in some organizations, you can argue that organizations that do things like billable hours, oh, we know where people are. No, you don't. Nobody reports their actual hours, right? We know, in most cases, actually, people underreport their hours, their caps. So people start saying, look, I worked, really, 40 hours this week on that project, plus the rest of my other work, but all I can report, because I'm only allowed a certain number of hours, is 30. So the challenge we have is this is happening in our organizations with remarkably little oversight. And it introduces a number of challenges. So we said we want to talk about what's the impact of this phenomenon. Well, we said that we do this for individuals because it allows for knowledge transfer and empowerment. These sound wonderful. However, when you look at what's actually happening, there's some other stuff that gets in the way. Transition costs. For each individual, when you're on multiple teams, multiple projects, every time you want to switch to the next one, you have to then say, okay, sorry, so what did you guys do while I was gone? We need to get up to speed. We need to relearn. Sometimes we need to recalibrate. We have to reconnect with the people. And that takes time. It is a cost. And one of the consequences of that is very often fatigue and stress and, unfortunately, burnout. Burnout and stress because people are constantly moving back and forth. I've got a project over here. I've got a project over here. They're both asking me for things, both of which are due last week, and both of which I can't do at the same time. So people are feeling pulled, they're feeling stressed, and so all these nice benefits that we say, oh, isn't it wonderful? We can create empowerment, we can make people learn. We start running into some very real problems. The problems aren't only felt at the individual level. We said the reason we do this for teams, for collaborations, is one, it lets us tackle larger scale, more complex challenges and problems. And again, knowledge transfer, not individual learning here, but knowledge transfer between teams, between projects. Best practices get shared from project A to project B for the very simple reason that one person happens to be in both projects and says, hey guys, guess what I just did over there? But again, these often get overrun, overshadowed by new challenges. Just like there's an individual transition that has to happen as I move into a new project. There are additional coordination costs when all of my team members are switching in and out, balancing their time and their effort between different projects. I have to keep reacclimating them. I have to recalibrate our work. Sometimes we have to go back and rehab the same discussions we've had because not everyone was there. Plus, we weren't all in the room together to build a shared understanding. A lot of my work is around shared context, shared identity. How do you build that up? Guess what? It's a lot harder to do when people aren't all there together with the same shared experience and the same block of time. And as a result, we get reduced cohesion. Those teams aren't as teamy anymore. That's a technical term. It's actually legit. They're not as teamy. They don't bond as strongly to one another. You'll be hearing from Amy Edmondson later on, and Amy's work is fundamental and fantastic in this domain about really understanding the roots of what drives trust. It becomes a lot harder to do when the population is shifting. And it's not even just individuals and teams, it has an impact on organizations as well. You knew this is where I was going to go as well, right? So on the one hand, we say, look, this improves our efficiency, this improves our flexibility and our adaptability and our ability to adjust, and again, for the organization, we get to transmit knowledge and information. Now, before I immediately show you what the challenges are, I have to introduce another new idea to you, and here's where I'm going to do what I love doing more than anything else. Poking you with a stick. I want to give you something to think about, maybe even something to get a little bit nervous about, that maybe, I think, you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about before. And it's this, something called human capital interdependence. In all of your organizations, you spend time as an organization thinking about interdependencies that exist, interdependencies in your processes. Project A needs to complete what it's doing to hand it over to Project B. Project B can't start working until it has the output from Project A. Well, if you know that exists, it tells you some things. Well, let's make sure we protect Project A, because if A stops, B and C and D and E and everything else follow suit. Maybe we need to think about how we buffer in the system to make sure that we don't end up with overruns or underruns. We spend a lot of time thinking about how we protect against this, how we hedge against process risk. I'm here to point out that there's a different type of risk that we tend not to think about. It's human capital interdependence. This is the risk that comes because two different projects, which may have absolutely nothing to do with one another in terms of the work that they're doing, the task, the objectives, anything like that, may in your organization actually be very tightly linked together, lockstep, solely because they share members. Because individuals on one project are also individuals of the other project, therefore they become the conduits through which things affect from one project to another, or infect from one project to another. You can think of this as a special case of input interdependence, which is something that organizations think about a lot. Certainly your folks, your friends, your colleagues in operations, they're very familiar with this. But now you have something you can bring back to them and say, hey, I've got my own problem. What about this challenge about human capital interdependence? And this is particularly relevant as everybody likes to talk about VUCA. Who here likes to talk about VUCA? VUCA is the sort of happy, trendy buzzword. Let's talk about things about variability, about uncertainty, about complexity, about ambiguity. It's basically saying everybody likes to fixate on the fact that the world is way more uncertain than it used to be, or at least that's what we like to think. So we have to be planning for that. We have to be thinking about that. And this is a particular challenge when you have human capital interdependence. So let me explain a little bit about why, and why this is something I'm fixated on and really concerned about. Every organization experiences shocks, not electrical shocks necessarily, but shocks in various forms. That shock could be A product recall on your flagship product. Not something you were planning for, certainly something you weren't hoping for, but you better deal with it when it happens. The shock could be a change in the regulatory environment, new tariffs, trade regulations, border disputes, things that affect where you can sell, to whom, and when, and how. These could be natural disasters. This could be the flu. Anything that affects and hits your organization you weren't planning on introduces a shock. Here's the challenge that we now have. When you have teams that are sharing individuals, like for example, I have two little illustrations in the middle, when a shock hits that one team, what's the first thing that happens? Right? Something serious happens in your team, the call goes out, all hands on deck, everybody, quick, we need help, triage. All the people who were shared across other projects immediately turn their back on their other projects and say, let's focus in here. Which means all those other projects now take a hit. Maybe they had nothing to do with the product recall. Maybe they operate in a different geographical market, but you have centralized functions. Doesn't matter. They now suddenly are facing a hit because of something that happened in a team with which they share members. This creates ripples. It creates ripples that go throughout the organization, where a shock that hits one team actually ripples through other teams in the organization. And here's where things get really cool. And I say really cool because as an academic, I get to think about what's interesting about it. You guys have to deal with it. The pattern of the interdependencies changes the nature of the ripple. If you think about it, right, the example that I gave, the picture, these two illustrations, the one on top is a team that shares lightly with many other teams. Lots of other teams where they maybe share one member. When a shock hits that team, lots of other teams have a little bit of a shock, a little ripple that goes through. They all lose one member, they can deal with it. If they have a little bit of slack, they absorb it, everyone's happy. But what happens if you have a situation like the one on the bottom? Two teams that share not a little, but a lot. 50% of the team is actually on either of two teams. When a shock hits the first team, the result is a tsunami. It's very targeted. It doesn't affect lots of the organization, but the teams it affects, it hits hard. And they transmit very hard as well. So now we start realizing that if we want to take this seriously, we actually have to have a good understanding of not just whether or not people share membership, but how much they share, the severity of that, and even the pattern and the structure within the organization. So here's where I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the recent research. Here's the literal, fresh, hot off the presses stuff. This is some work we've been doing. It's a collaborative project with researchers, some of us at INSEAD, some at Rotterdam School of Management, some at University of Reggio Emilia in Modena. We've been using the data that we have collected in the field as the basis for doing agent-based modeling that allows us to create massive scenarios and run huge calculations to understand the way in which these effects play out in a way that we could never do by going out and asking you, so how's it working in your organization? How about yours? How about yours? On the order of 25 million projects that we're able to analyze in one single run, and believe me, we've done hundreds, if not thousands of these. The things that we look at in trying to understand this, we look at resource utilization. How much slack is in the system? How much downtime among all the people in the system and across all the projects? Project completion. What percentage of our projects actually reach completion? What number overall? And timeliness, because we all know that just getting the project done doesn't make everybody happy if the project is late. So we actually look at the effect of all of these things in the context of these negative shocks. And yes, we focused on negative shocks. We can look at positive shocks. If you want to imagine what would happen if the magical HR fairy came down and said, here, more people for you, extra resources. We can model that and look at that too, but I thought it would be a lot less interesting for you guys. So we focused on the negative ones, the reality check of what happens when shocks hit the system. I want to give you three things to think about, three things to poke you a bit with a stick. Number one, there's a trade-off in this relationship between resource utilization and individual flexibility. What I mean by that is, as we utilize the resources in our organization more. We squeeze out the slack time, the downtime, which we as HR professionals also say, look, this is part of our role to find out how do we best utilize the human capital we have. What that does is it actually creates a perverse problem. By squeezing out that slack, you end up with a bunch of people who have so little slack time, it becomes difficult to actually launch new projects. So this is a really interesting situation where by increasing what you get done, you reduce what you're able to do large scale. And very often this happens, you can think about this, at the end, everybody has little, the only time people have left, the only slack people have left is little 5-minute blocks, which is really hard to cobble together into something meaningful. So, challenge 1 is to think about this trade-off and think about what is actually the right amount of slack in the system, human capital slack in the system. Trade-off number 2. Efficiency versus timeliness. We say, hey, one of the great things is people can actually load balance, right? We're able to allow them to make sure that they use their time as effectively as possible, applying it to the best things they can. So by being able to allocate their time more dynamically, it has actually a negative effect on project completion, because what you introduce is a tremendous amount of complexity in trying to get the projects done. If everybody gets to allocate and say, you know what, I actually think I should spend more of my time on Project Alpha this week, not on Project Beta, that introduces gaps. You may have some members of your team who are really only dedicated to that team on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, others who are really focusing Tuesday and Thursday, and they never even get to sit down in the project room together. So, by squeezing out and allowing flexibility, we actually also can create a perverse problem where it becomes harder for us to actually get things done on time. Projects take longer, they bleed over because of all this transition cost. And one last thing to think about. Neighborhoods matter. I don't mean this kind of neighborhood, but I mean neighborhoods in terms of the ecosystem that a team is in, the ecosystem that a project is in. When you start looking at the impact of these ripples as they go through the organization, as you would expect, they decrease very, very, very quickly. There's a dying off of the effect. Basically what happens is every time a ripple hits a project that has a little bit of extra slack, some of that ripple gets absorbed, comes out of the system. But that structure matters. And if you don't actually know what the pattern looks like, if you don't actually know whether or not those ripples are light and far or tsunamis hitting one team, you're going to misallocate your resources. You're not going to plan accordingly to make sure that you have the slack where it needs to be in order to buffer effectively. So where does this leave us? This idea of multi-teaming, multi-team membership is a double-edged sword. There's no question. On the one hand, it's a vulnerability. We have introduced into our organizations, by moving away from that nice, classic, top-down, hierarchical model that we all know and love, we've moved away from all the bureaucratic tedium of saying everything has to be top-down and structured, where everybody is only in their one team. But in so doing, we've introduced a new risk coming from these shocks that can move throughout the linked projects in the team, in the organization. At the same time, the good news, there is some good news, is this exact same structure is also one of the tools that we can use. Those interlinked projects allow us, they give us a vehicle to move people back and forth, to move people, to reallocate them across projects, to think about how do we ensure that they are where they need to be? How do we ensure that they can absorb the impact of any of these VUCA-related shocks that we fit? In this way, this idea, this concept acts in part like a shock absorber. It can take some of that variability out of the system. Okay, so some of you are thinking, well, that was interesting. I wasn't expecting that. but now what? Where do we go with this? So let me give you some ideas, right? I am an academic, but I'm actually, by original training, I'm an engineer. I was a computer scientist for a lot of years. So I'm not one of those people who likes to think big thoughts and stuff and then say, okay, now good luck. I actually like to try to solve problems. So we've gone into organizations and really worked with organizations to try to understand how do we try to address these. And just like the impact and the challenges are felt at the individual level, at the team level, and at the organizational level, no surprise, the ways to tackle them equally have to be addressed at different levels. So I'm going to start in the reverse order because I think for the audience that we have in the room, first place you got to think about is the organization itself. So number one, first thing you've got to do, you have to map and understand the pattern of interconnection across the projects and teams in your organizations. Right? And this is, again, for two different reasons. One, we said one of the things we want to get out of cross-staffing people is learning, knowledge transfer, sharing of information across projects. You're never going to be able to know where that's going or what information can be shared or even what information is stuck in a little pool with no way to get into the rest of the organization if you don't have a good sense of what the overall pattern and structure looks like. Number two, if you want to try to prepare for the shocks, be ready for the shocks, be ready to handle the VUCA challenges that you're facing, you need to also understand where they're going to ripple, where they're going to be tsunamis, and how you can get ahead of them with the design and structure of your organizations and your staffing. Moving a level down, what do the people who are actually in the teams, in the trenches, doing the work, needing to think about? Well, number one, first things first, you've got to launch well. Now, I am a teams and groups person. This is what I started doing research on. This is what a huge portion of my research on is how to build effective teams. And for all teams, launching well is important. Getting people on the same page, helping them to understand not just the work-related stuff, but also the interpersonal stuff is critically important. It's even more important in this context, given the variability and the changes. And you need booster shots. Here's where things differ a little bit. If you're sitting in one team, you've got to launch it well. But when you have team members who are moving in and out, shifting into your project and out of your project, you need to give them reminders about the stuff that was out of their brain when they were focused on the other project. When I'm focused here, let's be honest, all the stuff going on in my other projects is not top of mind. So not only do I have to readjust and reacclimate when I come back into the other projects, I also have to be reminded about the fact that, you know what, hey, I like these guys. They were fun. We had a good time. I enjoyed this project. I trust these people. We need those booster shots because trust and things like that have a half-life. And you have to manage time across teams. And here's a very important thing. This sits somewhere between the team level and the organizational level. And here's one of my charges to all of you as HR professionals. You have to think not just about what's going on in a team. Part of your job as team leaders and part of your job as those advising team leaders is to get people to change their perspective to not only think inside the team but also across the team. This comes back to that point I raised earlier where I asked people, how many of you know who's in your team? Yes. How many of you know what other teams you're on? Yes. How many of you know what other teams your other people are on? No. You need to understand that. And part of the reason you have to is because part of your job, part of the job of the team leader is to help the team members manage these processes. In particular, a good way to think about this, think about those people who get to enjoy working in the tax industry. Now, most of you, this is not your favorite time of year. We all know what tax season is like, right? Everybody walks around with it. It doesn't matter where you live in the world. Everybody hates tax season. everybody walks around with a sour expression on their face. Now here's the challenge. If you work for a company that does, for example, tax assistance, tax preparation, for most of the year, you're kind of doing low-key stuff, it's maintenance work, etc. But there's a window of time around tax day where all hell breaks loose. Your phone never stops ringing, everybody is bothering you. Now here's the problem. If your entire organization is on the same calendar, all the peaks coincide. That means a shock that hits one team, unfortunately hits at the same time as the shock that hits all of the other teams it shares members with. And you get a multiplier effect. This is the real tsunami. So one of the challenges you need to think about is understanding how to manage people's time, not just in the team, but also across the teams with the other teams they share members with. Two more at the level of the team. You also need to think about mapping the skills for the very simple reason that you don't have the kind of time you typically have in traditional team settings. People are moving in and out. You need to help your team members to know who to go for what information because they don't have the time to build and establish that knowledge on their own. It's called a transactive memory system. We don't build it in the same way when the members are changing. And last but not least, of course, you also have to create a learning environment. And what I mean by that is you have to pay attention to the learning and the development of the people within these teams. Because particularly as we squeeze them tighter and tighter, we make them more and more overcommitted, the less time they have that is slack, not only does it pose a problem for ripples, it's also time they don't spend thinking, reflecting, integrating new ideas and new knowledge into their organization and into themselves. Which brings us last, but certainly not least, to a few things we can do as individuals. Number one, you have to figure out your own big picture. What I mean by that is as an individual who is split across different projects, you have to have an understanding of what that looks like. Many of us don't. Many of us sort of add on projects piecemeal, we lose some, we don't actually have a big picture view of, so what am I actually doing right now? As individuals working in this environment, that is one of our challenges, is we have to have that big picture. We also have to focus not just internally, but externally. We have a tendency to view this as survival of the fittest. Oh, I'm on 5 different teams. Look how awesome I am because I get to manage across all of this stuff and I always succeed. We have to be willing to show some vulnerability in line with our earlier comments around you need to actually build an organization that takes an honest look at itself. You need to do the same thing. You need to manage that and proactively get out to your key stakeholders and let them know what your challenges are across the projects they don't realize you have. And last but not least, you have to take ownership of your own development. It is not just an outsourced task. This is about both knowing thyself and forcing thyself. Know what your goals are and force yourself to take time. The number one thing that we see when we talk to people in organizations that they wrestle with is the lack of time. They are squeezed and pulled at the same time. And they're stretched so thin, they don't have the time to actually stop, to reflect, to integrate. So I hope I've given you some things to think about. As I said, my job here was primarily to poke you with a stick, to get you thinking about something that maybe you haven't in the past. And they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, so here's about 10,000 words in one slide. Right? I want you to keep this in mind. Think about some of these elements. I will be here for much of the Congress, happy to chat and have some further discussions with you. But that wraps up what I've got to say. Thank you so much.